Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Blood of Tyrants by Naomi Novik. We are on book 8 of the Temeraire series, and this is the penultimate book in the series. And it's a bit of a monster. I think this is the longest of the series as of yet. I think. I'm not sure. But as usual, when I'm reviewing a book that's a later book in a series, there will be spoilers for earlier books in this series. So if you have not read book 1 through 7 of the Temeraire series, yeah, this is maybe the moment to stop. Go back, read those books, watch all 7 of my reviews of them, and then come back for this video. But we start in this book with Lawrence having no idea who or where he is, which turns out he's in Japan. It seems he was shipwrecked, and he quickly regains the memory of who he is, but with a bit of a gap. He does not remember Temeraire, he does not remember the last 8 years, nor any of his life as an aviator. And from that point on, he has to find his way through a country that wants him dead for simply being a foreigner on their shores, to the dragon that he does not even remember, all the while Temeraire is in a high panic. Everyone is telling him that Lawrence must be dead, but he refuses to accept this. Yet his duties to the half-sunken ship that they were on, to his country, and to his friends keep him from striking out on his own to save Lawrence. Can they come together in time for Lawrence to remember who he is, complete their desperate mission to China, and head Napoleon off at a possibly ill-advised invasion of Russia? Who knows? Read the series to find out. And that last bit, I will admit, might have been a little bit of a spoiler, but if you know any history, or can look at the cover of the book and see what is obviously a Russian building on the cover of the book, you suspect they're gonna end up in Russia at some point. So I'd argue it's not really a spoiler. And objectively, this book is just a bit hard to synopsize and not feel like you're leaving way too much out, because, like some of the earlier books in the Temeraire series, this felt less like a singular book and more like a collection of stories that all happen to be happening to the same characters immediately after each other, that have similar themes, and, will build up to be a bigger story. This is a series that does feel more like the series is the the series is more important than each individual book, and you can sometimes feel that in the books where there are scenes that need to happen in the series, but don't really necessarily make sense in the book itself. And some books like this one, which are just a collection of things that are happening towards the end of the series, and, here we have the story of Lawrence lost in Japan, a second story in China, and then a completely separated third story in Russia. And I will say, the one in Russia does feel a little bit incomplete for me, which is sort of really normal in a long series. The penultimate book often does feel like it just sort of stops, and that it's all building up to the last book, and quite often I do feel like the last book was originally in a much longer book that just got chopped in half. But I will say, having not read book 9 as of yet, I'm sort of wondering why we cut where we did in this book rather than just ending right at the beginning of part 3. I feel like it would have felt more like a complete book to have it end there, but it's probably just a length thing. If you included all of Russia in the last book, it would have been way too much to put into book 9. But I do also feel like maybe some parts of part 3 were a little bit unnecessary. And I don't mean unnecessary to happen. They need to happen for the series to make sense. I get that. I'm just not entirely 100% behind them happening on page. There's a lot of part 3 that is the wars and organizational hell stuff that we saw already in the invasion of Prussia. There's a lot of no one listening to Lawrence, a lot of trying to find people to speak the right language who will actually listen to them, a lot of concern about what the hell these dragons are going to eat. And yeah, that's war, that makes sense. But I do feel like it's ground we've already covered extensively in this series. These things have all come up in previous books multiple times, and it's always been expansive parts of the book. So I feel like here it could have been covered in a time skip and then exposition afterwards. Just have us pick up in the middle of the battle and have Lawrence or Temeraire thinking about how irritating it was that they could have gotten here so much quicker and so many lives could have been saved if, you know, this thing hadn't happened. Like, I feel like that could have been done here, and this book already shows that it is perfectly okay to drastically time skip things. Like, there is a lot of time skipping in this book, including some scenes that I feel like a lesser author would feel the need to include, just because, you know, it's talked about. It therefore needs to be in there. But Naomi Novik has the eye to say, no, it doesn't. I can skip straight to the actual action part of this and leave out all the build-up. The rising action isn't needed for this. And I feel like part 3 just needed her to be a little bit more judicious with cutting. But that's my opinion. Other than that, I'm really happy with the weird structure of this book. In fact, I sort of really love the fact that it does have a weird structure on a really selfish level. I spend a lot of time right now on writers' social media, like authors' threads, book talk, some on booktube, though not that much. And there's just a lot of talk of what a book has to be to get published. And so often it sounds like anything that doesn't fit a classic 3-act structure with an inciting incident that happens at exactly this point in the book, there's rising action taking up exactly this percentage of the book, and the climax happens at exactly this point in the book, and then there's falling action for this percentage of the book. If it doesn't fit that structure, it's wrong and will never be published. But stories aren't that simple. A lot of stories do have a bit more convoluted of a structure than that. A lot of classics in particular do not follow that structure in the least. But they're still brilliant, and they're still worthy of reading. And I'm not sure why we're forcing ourselves to fit in this narrow idea of what a story is now. And this book proves that. It does really have completely separate stories. It has 3 separate inciting incidences, 3 separate climaxes, and, like, no falling action somehow for any of them. Like, or it's jumped straight from one climax to the next inciting incident. And it's not one of those occasions where, yeah, but it's, like, smaller humps on a roller coaster and then the big hump at the end that's the real climax. No. This book, honestly, the climaxes of both part 1 and part 2 feel a lot more climaxy than the climax of part 3. And the characters are not at their lowest at the beginning in the middle of Act 2. That's not a thing in this book. I would honestly say the inciting incident of the entire book takes place off page. Like, we don't even see it. We jump in after the inciting incident. And I like it. I am still totally invested in this book, even though the structure is not what people are saying is necessary. I'm still drawn along with the narrative. I still see a fulfilling conclusion to this. And it's only when I step back and look at it from a distance that I even notice that it has a really odd structure for a modern novel. And it's just really nice to see that and to have that remembrance of, no, you don't have to follow this really simple 3-act structure. You can make it more complex. You can, like, you know, move things around, have a little bit of fun with it. And you can tell a story equally as effectively, even though you're not following the norm. That being said, I do think the choice of having Lawrence lose his memory at the beginning of the penultimate book was a really clever choice. It lets us see exactly how far Lawrence has grown, see the direct comparison of how he acted in book 1 versus, you know, 8 years later in book 8. And it gave us this excuse to slightly recap the previous events, while also doing it in an interesting way that's little bits here, little bits there. It's not like, hey, Lawrence, I'm going to sit down and tell you everything that happened in your past. And it felt really natural, and it felt like just the reminder I needed, considering I'm not reading these books one after another. It's been a while since I picked one up. So yeah, there were bits that I had completely forgotten happened. And the little hints that Lawrence needed to remember, I also needed. And it did provide a nice, like, a collection of nice emotional gut punches. And I was really worried when I picked it up, because I had read the back, I knew that Lawrence lost his memory, and I felt like, that's a little bit soap opera-y. Like, oh my god, are we in an 1800s melodrama? Like, what is this? But at the same time, it was really cool getting to see Lawrence rediscover who he is, and more importantly, rediscover why and how he became the person he is. And I really like the fact that even though it's not directly stated, I think having like him having to basically be reintroduced to himself helped Lawrence come to terms even more with his own choices. Like the Australia book, a lot of that one is just about Lawrence coming to terms with his choices and where they've led him, but it did feel a little bit like intellectually he'd come to terms, but not necessarily emotionally, and this book really helped him come to terms emotionally, and come to terms not just with his own choices, but what it has turned his life into. And I love the silly little contrast of Temeraire just not understanding Lawrence's priorities, because it feels really silly, it feels really fun, but it is such a beautiful use of a theme that is continuously used throughout the series. And like, this is a place that the dual perspective is really, really useful. There are moments when Lawrence is literally directly like mourning the loss of his honor, and Temeraire is sitting there being like, oh god, he's mad that I lost him his fortune and he can't get married. And like, it's such a straightforward and malicious like statement of, yeah, people aren't always going to have the same priorities and you can still get along. But more than that, it's a very emotive way of doing it. And we continue to see these characters running through all these different countries and all these different cultures that have different priorities, different moralities, different, you know, ways of living. And sometimes it's a bit ham-fisted with the statements of like, hey look, people have different priorities and that doesn't necessarily make one right and one wrong. But sometimes even the ham-fisted moments really, really, really work for me. Like, in the beginning here, in the book, there's a bit of a confusion between Lawrence and a character named Kaneko about what honor means, what is the honorable end to what's going on in the life at the moment. Like, they both think they are aiming at what's honorable, and they're coming to, like, basically to loggerheads because they're seeing it as something different. And it's ham-fisted. It's very clearly, like, literally, the author basically tells us, look, they have a different idea of honor. But I don't mind. It's still really well done. And I'm especially okay with it being super duper blunt because there's also a much more subtle ending of it where we get to see Lawrence still respecting Kaneko, because he's like, I know what I think he's doing is not really honorable, but I know he's being honorable to his idea of honor, and I respect that. And even though it's not stated, we're not in his head, we can see the other character having that same vibe. And it really works because it does not need to be stated in that point. So we get both a ham-fisted version and a more subtle version in the exact same scene. Also, I love that entire segment because we see Lawrence accepting things and him being like, I'm not even sure why I'm accepting this. I'm not sure why I'm okay with this. Why am I settling into this way of thinking so quickly? And like, we as readers know it's because he's had 7 books worth of growth to get to this point. Like, he's already had that emotional journey, even though he doesn't remember it. So we get to see him emotionally being the Lawrence we have, you know, grown with, while intellectually thinking of himself still as the Lawrence he was in book 1. And it was such a cool little contrast. And it felt really right, and it felt really interesting. And also, I loved the way Lawrence's memory came back. Which, spoiler here, yeah, his memory comes back. I don't know if anyone would go into this book thinking it wouldn't, but it starts with him getting hints here and there that he remembers little bits. He remembers a name. He remembers, like, a image that doesn't make sense out of context. And then most of it does come back in, like, one solid moment. There's one moment where he's like, aha, now I remember. But he's still having to piece it together. It's still like he's gotten a puzzle that he suddenly has just dropped in his lap, all the pieces, and he still has to put them together. And even after he has it back together, he knows what happened to him. He still has moments where he's clearly trying to figure out, do I have all the puzzle pieces? Am I still missing stuff? Have I still forgotten something? I don't know what's happening. And I just really like it. I have no idea if it's actually authentic to how traumatic temporary amnesia would work, but it felt right, and it definitely felt right within the story. Like, it makes emotive sense for the themes and the character arcs. And also, I just absolutely love Chef Kiss. It was perfect. The moment when Lawrence is wondering if he purposefully forgot the most traumatic parts of his life, and, like, did he remember now because he's allowing himself to remember? And I love it because, yeah, it sort of feels like that in the narrative. It feels like, yeah, that's what's going on. And then we have Tharke just saying, no, dumbass, you had a head injury. Like, it is just like you to attribute to you, like, make yourself feel at fault for something that was caused by a traumatic head injury. And it was just a lovely little moment. And on that note, yes, Lawrence regains his memory, spoiler alert, when he re-meets Tharke. And it's not fair to play with the shipping part of my brain like that. Like, are you kidding? I already like Tenzing Tharke more than any other character in this series. Like, he is my favorite beyond the main characters, and I absolutely loved him. And when when it became clear he was going to reappear in the series, I was like, oh my god! And then they immediately, like, connect, and when nobody else, all these people that Lawrence has deep emotional connections to, did not spark his memory, but Tharke did, and I'm like, are you trying to make me ship them? Because congratulations, it worked! And a cursory Google shows I'm not alone. There definitely are people out there who have drawn lovely fan art and written fan fiction about the two of them together, so I know it's not me. And you just can't have my favorite character reappear in this series and have Lawrence remember him when nobody else he remembers without me, like, stopping to Google fan art. That just was going to happen. So, let's put that aside in its own box over here. I will also say this one continues tackling some really heavy themes in really interesting ways. The treatment of the Russian dragons and how it invokes images of chattel slavery, which, you know, chattel slavery in comparison to the way the dragons are treated has been a continuing theme throughout the series. It really works for me here. Like, this was continuing being strong in that way. And, like, the horrors that sentient creatures are driven to when they have been so horrifically abused worked. It was very strong. The illusion of the honor in war, that is a theme that is growing more and more throughout this series, and I love it whenever it pops its ugly head up. It is so well done. And there was this absolutely lovely line in this book that I just thought was amazing. The pause stretched on for a moment. For a minute, for 3. Lawrence half wondered if perhaps it might go on, no one wishing to continue. If a little space might break through whatever illusion it was permitted men to desire battle and to give it. And it made me stop and just stare at the page for a while. That was a gorgeous line. And it's such a lovely way of painting Lawrence's absolute disillusionment with the idea of honorable war. And, like, it's one of those things that has been evolving throughout the books along with everything else, that in the beginning he very much was that I'm an upright, honorable soldier. We do honorable shit. And as it goes on and he sees more and more death, he stops seeing the honor in it entirely. And there's another moment in the same book where a captured prisoner is being marched through the camp, and he thinks about how before this man had been cheered as an honorable adversary, but after this man has done these horrible war acts and have condemned men to die horrifically over what is really, like, just arrogance. It's such a moment of him noticing the silence of the people around him and noticing that everyone knows there is no honor in this anymore. It's just death and destruction. And also, I continue to admire the handling of Napoleon and the actual history here, because there's a lot to the French cause that a modern audience cannot help applaud. There's a lot to the French cause that makes us go, that actually sounds right. And Novik has not shied away from giving the French antagonists noble choices, of having them do things that Lawrence has to agree with and be like, yeah, I acknowledge you're not always wrong. But there's also the inexcusable swath of destruction and death that this war is leaving behind it. And I absolutely love, there's a scene in this book where we're getting to see a negotiation, and Napoleon is framing it as, you're forcing us to do this war. You're forcing us to invade you. And it's that sound. Like, there's something about it that perfectly captures the way people talk when they're like, yeah, you're forcing me to do this, even though it's clearly their choice. It really captures that vibe of, like, of people thinking they're in the right and doing good things and being sort of respectable in doing those good things, but also still being horrifically in the wrong. And that's such an interesting balance. And, like, because there is so much real history here, it's a really difficult balance to make, because of course you want to tell your own story. You want to, like, have your own themes, your own narrative, but you're stuck with some real history. And at this point, yeah, we've drifted pretty far from real history. Like, we know some of this shit did not happen in actual Napoleonic Wars, but it doesn't matter, because there's still elements of it that are real, and I know we're going to roughly the same end. Like, I actually don't know that at this point. At this point, I finally have accepted that, yeah, this Napoleonic War might end differently than the one in the real world. I don't know. In fact, I know it will end differently, but I don't know. There's still a lot up in the air, and I do find it interesting that the further along in this series I read, the less I feel like I know what's gonna happen. And that is such a cool trick for something set in a real time period, with real figures really doing a lot of the same things they did in real life. But on that note, I will say, I think these moments at the end here, and specifically there's a moment where a character does something that in one way is perfectly the correct decision, is perfectly the only moral thing you could do, while at the same time doing it for the wrong reason and doing it in the wrong way. And I think that's the reason part 3 had to be in this book and not in the next one, because that is the culmination of themes for this book. Like, yeah, the themes of, the question of what is acceptable in the face of an existential threat, is doing the honorable thing honorable when it gets thousands killed. How many people are you willing to condemn to die to do what is seen as the better thing? And, like, these have all been themes throughout the entire series. And these are all decisions that Lawrence has made over and over and over again throughout the series. But so many of them have happened in moments where he didn't really have a choice, where it was very stark and, like, very obvious. And so many of the times he did not know the outcome was going to be as drastic as it was. And so, in many ways, having Lawrence lose his memory was also a way to have him reassess that, and to have him remake these decisions in real time. As he's regaining his memory, he has to decide, do I still agree with the choices I made? Do I still think I was in the right? Do I condemn myself? Or do I accept that I did the right thing? And it really does culminate with those moments in the very end of the book. And so in many ways, even though action-wise, and, like, you know, traditional climax-wise, the climax of this book does not feel like a climax, thematically and character arc-wise, it does. It's just one of those you have to stand back at a distance to see it. Other than that, I don't know, I just really liked the book. I still love these characters. I still love the way Naomi Novik writes dragons as both familiar and other. I still love the way the history intertwines with the story that Novik wants to tell us. I love the fact that more and more as the story progresses, I am wondering how the war's gonna end. And, like, yeah, I assumed when I started it the Napoleonic War was going to end the same way, and now I'm not entirely sure about that. And, like, yeah, we're lining up for that, but I'm not sure that's the choice that she's going to make. And I love, love, love the absolute brutal horror of the way war is treated in these books. Like, it is not treated lightly, it is horrific, and it's a relatively light series of books otherwise. Like, it feels like all this heavy shit is happening. A lot of these books are about enslavement and war, and yet at the same time, they don't feel heavy when I'm reading them. And I love the fact that Lawrence and Temeraire are out here collecting people from all over the world as this, like, global found family that they just keep pulling more people in, and I just love it. It's really fucking cute. And I think this book in particular is a bit more Lawrence's story than it is Temeraire's, even though they do still roughly share the narration, but it definitely feels more like Lawrence's character arc is a bigger part of this one. But I still love the fact that even so, we still get emotional growth and little moments of change and little moments of Temeraire working things out as well. Overall, this book has left me really excited and curious about the last book in this series.